Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where for 97 years, issues of the day and provocative questions have been discussed and debated. My name is Jan Roller, and I am president of the club. Our topic today is the death penalty and the questions it poses about the dignity of human life. Our speaker is Sister Helen Prejean, who has been called a feisty nun with a big heart, the Mother Teresa of death row, and an outspoken critic of politicians and the legal system in her quest to eliminate the death penalty worldwide. The United States is the only Western democracy that executes people. Sister Helen's recent remarks have taken aim here in Ohio, where a failed lethal injection 3 days ago prevented the execution of a man convicted in 1984 of the rape and murder of a 14-year-old. Sister Helen grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and entered the convent at 18. Her comfortable, private spirituality was shaken when she became the pen pal of Patrick Saunier, a convicted killer of 2 teenagers who was on death row in Louisiana's Angola State Prison. She came when he asked her to visit, and her observation of the process by which the state executes the condemned led to her book and film Dead Man Walking in 1995. She worked closely with the movie's producer, director Tim Robbins, and Susan Sarandon, the actress who played Sister Helen in the movie. But Sister Helen is sensitive to both sides of the death penalty issue, murderers and the victims' families. She has used her organizing skills to found Survive, a victims' family support group in New Orleans. Her second book is The Death of Innocence, an eyewitness account of wrongful execution, published in December of 2004. It is an account of 2 men who Sister Helen believes were innocent and who she accompanied to their executions. In the book, she also examines the recent history of death penalty decisions by the United States Supreme Court and the track record of then Governor of Texas, George W. Bush. Sister Helen has appeared on almost every talk show across this nation, and she espouses the consistent life ethic. As well as her views against the death penalty, she is also against abortion, euthanasia, and suicide. Please welcome our fascinating guest today to the podium, Sister Helen Prejean.
Okay, folks, we'll make every minute count. Thank you for having me here today. I've been here before. I love Cleveland. You're like the cultural center of the world here. But there's a problem. Ohio, you have 166 people on death row. You've executed 33 people. You tried really hard. And I have to say you, because our hands are in it when it's our state. It's the way democracies work. You don't have the death penalty in this country without the support of the people, at least tacitly. And so if Governor Strickland doesn't hear from a whole lot of people, Mr. Broom is they're going to make another attempt in a week to kill him again. They tried to puncture, 18 times to find a vein. Lethal injection, you see, is supposed to be quiet and humane. You just put them to sleep. When lethal injection came into Louisiana, one of the associate wardens said, "Gonna be boring. It's gonna be nothing to see. Just go to sleep." Justice Antonin Scalia, a fellow Catholic, said, "How enviable a quiet death by lethal execution when you compare what happened to the victims." What's the value system he's working out of? A quiet, enviable death, lethal injection. Does everybody know about pancurmonium bromide that paralyzes the person completely? If the sleep potion thing doesn't work, you're fully alive and conscious. You can't lift a finger. You can't cry out when they kill you. Why do we try to make death so antiseptic? And I want to make a connection with the death penalty. And I know I'm going to push you hard on this. And maybe you never even made the connection. But see, I've accompanied 6 people to execution. And I watched 3 people as they're electrocuted to death, and I've watched 3 human beings as they're lethally injected. It is easy to kill a monster. This person, look at this crime, look what they did. It is hard to kill a real human being. And I don't know what's happening with the guards and the people on that team that were trying to insert those needles in Mr. Broom. And when at one point he tried to help him find the vein in his arm, and when at one point he put his hands over his face and began to cry and lost his composure because it was taking so long. There are stories in here about the real killing of human beings. I have a friend who belongs to the John Adams program of the ACLU that is defending suspected terrorists in Guantanamo. And we are going through an era in this country where the acceptance of torture has been approved from the White House on down, and it provided the climate in which what has happened in Guantanamo. How did we get to a point where we said we could accept torture in order to get information that we needed in order to save our people? How do we get there? There's always climate before there's action. And what happened at Abu Ghraib and what happened on Guantanamo, and I know from Denny LaBeouf, you know, in the John Adams Project, I know some of the stuff that goes on. I know the Red Cross report. I know that they had a kid as young as 16 that they pulled off the street, suspected terrorists. What's the evidence? What's the charge? And they called him a frequent flyer, and they moved him from cell to cell. They'd let him sleep an hour, then they go wake him up, move him to another cell. And within a number of weeks, the kid is banging his head on the wall. There was a graffiti written on the wall in one of the secret interrogation places: no blood, no foul. The modern form of torture. You don't show blood. You do waterboarding. You freeze people. You deprive them of meals. You deprive them of sleep. You tie them up in stress positions. How do we do that? And it is related, I believe, to the death penalty because nobody sees the pain. And look at the terrible crime they did. They deserve to die. A quiet, enviable death by lethal injection. How did I get there? Believe me, when I started out as a nun, I never knew I'd ever go to death row. You don't start out as a nun saying you're going to go to death row. I mean, you know, I was teaching kids in school. It was like, but it was an awakening in my own faith about what Jesus was about. And for years, what I thought Jesus was about was being my Savior. I prayed for people. I was always charitable. Charity was always paramount. But I didn't get it about justice. And I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where African American people, the only ones I knew personally, were people who were our servants. I went to an all-white private school. I rode buses where black people were forced to go in the back of the bus. I never questioned it because I didn't know people personally. And when I awakened to Jesus, which is the call to justice and to be with those who have no voice and to be with those who are marginated and downtrodden, my teachers became African American people in the St. Thomas Housing Project in New Orleans. And that's where I learned about the other America. That's where I learned about what if you're a black man and police stop you and pick you up and what happens to you. Or if you're a person with resources, what happens to you? I'm going to St. Joseph Academy and learning how to do public debate in high school, and kids are coming into Hope House in St. Thomas who are going to the public school in the 11th grade, and they can't read a third grade reader. The failures of public schools in inner cities because we got a two-tier system. I begin to see what happens in families when you don't have health care, when your kids die because you can't get health care. I begin to see it from the point of view of the people who are doing the suffering. And I, a woman of white privilege, my father a lawyer and a successful businessman, I never knew. And you know, I've been talking to audiences around this country, bringing them into the death penalty for 20 years now. And people, when I'm over in England, when I'm over in Europe, they say, what is it about the people of the United States? Why do you still have the death penalty in the United States? What is it about American people where they want this legalized vengeance? And you know what I've found with the people? It's not like people are wedded to the death penalty. Yeah, we got to have it. They never think about it because it doesn't touch most people's lives. And they're afraid of crime. And every night when they look at the nightly news, no matter all the peaceful things that have gone on here in Cleveland during the day, you're going to hear about the robbery, or you're going to hear about the rape, or you're going to hear about the crime, and feeding people. And we become afraid. So when someone runs for office and says, we're going to be really tough on crime, we're going to have the death penalty, we believe them. We say, yeah, we got to do something about this crime. Chances of being murdered in the United States are the same as accidental drowning. We think every time we go around a corner, somebody's going to murder us. Most of the murders, 90% of them in New Orleans, happen in the inner city, where poor people kill other poor people. It's when it happens in the suburbs, though. And it's overwhelming, the application of the death penalty. We look at the track record. We've been doing this for 30 years. 76, the Supreme Court put the death penalty back. And we start off with a really good theory of how it's supposed to work. And the Bill of Rights for everybody. And people accused of crime, you're going to have an attorney. You're going to be able to know your rights. You're going to be able to access them. And then the Supreme Court says now only the worst of the worst murders now. The death penalty is not for ordinary murders. Anybody tell me what that means? Well, they killed my mama, but it was like ordinary. It was a garden variety murder. And so then you start with aggravating circumstances you got to have the worst of the worst. And throw in then mitigating circumstances, and here you are, the jury, and here you're hearing like John Brooks in Louisiana, who killed 6 people. He killed them, bang, bang, bang. He was reloading to kill more people, and they overpowered him. And he's brought to trial in the New Orleans criminal court, and it was a slam dunk. He got the death penalty without the jury even taking a breath. He killed 6 people until an attorney in the appeals was able to do mitigation and tell John Brooks' story that the jury who sentenced him to death never heard. And so what does the jury hear? Look at this terrible crime. And they hear about John Brooks, that when his 13-year-old mother was pregnant for him, she thought she had a bad case of worms, and she's beating her stomach to get the worms out. And that was only the first beating John Brooks ever had. And he was never completely right and abused all through his life. Pumped the violence into John Brooks, and one day he explodes. He kills 6 people. And when the jury, the new jury, because they got a new sentencing hearing, heard this story of John Brooks, unanimously they agreed that the state of Louisiana, who had never done anything for him to help him, should not kill him but give him life. Imagine the dilemma of jurors. Only the worst of the worst now. What's not the worst of the worst when it's your loved one who's murdered? When a person's killed, the universe is lost. That can never be replaced. And so here you're the jury, just ordinary good folks like us sitting in here. Now you decide now, it's a terrible crime, but then look at his life and look what happened, and anything can come in mitigation. And so you have one mother who's the victim, daughter was killed, or somebody in her family, and it's saying to the jury, please, I ask you to give the ultimate penalty because it's going to honor my child's life. Anything less than the death penalty looks like you're dishonoring them. They killed my daughter and she's dead forever, and you're going to give them something less than death? And so all of that in people's minds, the equity of what does justice demand? A death for a death. That's the only fair thing. And then the jury hears the mother who says, please don't kill my son. What are you going to do? You know the story in the Bible about Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, and 2 women claiming the baby is their own. That's chicken feed next to these kind of things that jurors have to try to decide. Who has the wisdom to know this? We don't know. We don't. And then, of course, you have the system of law. You have the courts. You have the appeals. I honestly thought, when I went into this, Patrick Saunier was the first, I thought anybody who's going to go to trial for their life in this country may not have the best attorneys in the country, but at least they had decent attorneys who were going to fight for them to access their constitutional protections. We have 135 wrongfully convicted people who have come off a death row. And when you read the stories of what kind of defense they got, and prosecution, when you don't give them limits and boundaries, They have a lot of power. Not all prosecution. Let me speak here for the goodness of prosecutors, for the most part, across the United States, who do the right thing for the people, to save people, to protect people from really heinous crimes. But when you got the Green Bay Packers up against a high school varsity team, when you got a defense attorney like in Louisiana or like in Georgia, especially in the deep South states, or in the county here, where they're giving $12,500 for our death penalty case, for a capital case, and you suppose include your expert witnesses, everything in that. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars when you really do the defense well. Well, we're not going to put the money in for that, these criminals, these people. And what happens is prosecution's in charge of the evidence. Now, they're supposed to turn over any exculpatory evidence over to the defense. They're in charge of it. And all these 135 cases of people wrongfully convicted who, because college students who are volunteers in innocent projects, went and dug up all the stuff to get them out. It's always, most of the cases in Louisiana as well, the people who have come off of death row, it was evidence the jury never heard because it was not presented to them. Because the only bar you have to reach in a jury trial is reasonable doubt. The two people that I have accompanied to death, well, six, but Dobie Gillis Williams in Louisiana and Joseph Odell in Virginia. In Dobie's case, his attorney did nothing for him. There was no independent forensic testing, and he had an all-white jury, and a white woman had been killed in her bathroom in a little town of Manny, Louisiana. It was so slam dunk, all-white jury, and you just read the case, and you want to weep. He never had a chance. And then Joseph Odell, a man in Virginia, kept saying, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. And then he finds out the defense appointed to him is calling and telling the prosecution everything he's saying to him. He says, I'll go pro se. Better for me to defend myself than to have a defense attorney who's working against me. And they're moving along, it's all circumstantial, and then all of a sudden, surprise witness, Steve Watson pops up and seals the case by saying, Joe Odell confessed to me when we were in the cell together that he killed Helen Shartner, and Joe didn't even know how to do a credibility check on Steve Watson. He didn't know how to counter it. And Joe is killed. He's executed. I'm writing the book on it. And 6 years after I'm into it, Steve Watson, I get an email and I get a phone call, and he goes, what do I do? I lied, and Joe died. And I'm retired now. I got a bad heart, and I'm sitting in my living room, and Joe's face keeps coming in my living room. Jailhouse snitches are used. Steve Watson was allowed to give that testimony. Joe knew nothing of it. Surprise. And it prevailed. So when the prosecution wrapped up the case with Joe Odell, he just said it was circumstantial, but Steve Watson seals it for us. He takes the doubt out of it. Here there was a confession about it. And it kept Joe Odell, the story of Joe Odell is so amazing in a way. In another way, it's not. Italy gets involved in the case of Joe Odell. This is all in death of innocence. The night Joseph Odell is killed in Virginia, where nobody blinked an eye, one more person going to execution in Virginia, 5 million people in Italy were tuned to their radios to hear about the last moments of Joseph Odell. And Joseph Odell, because I got involved in the case, and I'm accompanying him and a woman, Laurie Ers, who was doing her best. She had volunteered for an innocence project, gets involved with this case of this man, Joseph Odell. Wow, look what happened here. Gets investigated, goes and does all the things that he was not able to do for himself. And the Italian Parliament hears about the case. Joseph Odell, this woman, lawyers, trying to do something. They send over representatives of the Italian Parliament. They send over the mayor of Palermo who had taken on the mafia, and he comes, visits Joseph, makes him an honorary citizen of Palermo, and says, Joseph, if they kill you, we will not let you be buried in Virginia soil. We will ship your body over, and we will have you buried in Palermo. And that's what happened, folks, at the end of it. And in that cross-section, in that web of providence and life, I get to have a dialogue with Pope John Paul. And Laura Ures was being brought over to Italy by the Italian Parliament, and she's going, Sister Ellen, I'm going to go and I'm going to visit these towns in Italy and all, and I'm going to go and they're going to arrange for a meeting with the Pope. Like, wouldn't you love to meet the Pope and talk to the Pope about death penalty? Because aren't nuns and popes, tight? Dialogue was happening all over the place in the Catholic Church about the death penalty because the church is always part of the world community. And dialogue, it was bubbling up about human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the Catholic community as well as in all the communities. So dialogue was going on. I was one part of the dialogue. But what I got to do was to put into Pope John Paul's lap the stories, because he's a pastoral man. And I was able to raise directly the question, Your Holiness, the Catholic Church in the Catechism clearly upholds the dignity of innocent life. What about guilty life? And when I'm walking with a man to execution and he's shackled hand and foot, he's been rendered completely defenseless. And he says to me, Sister, please pray that God holds up my legs. Because the dignity, he wants to maintain his dignity. He doesn't want to faint. He doesn't want his knees to buckle under him. Mr. Broom last Tuesday was trying so hard to maintain his dignity and his composure as they're trying to find the veins. And I said to the Holy Father, I said, Your Holiness, there is no dignity in someone who's put to death, who's been rendered defenseless. It's not self-defense for society. And the Pope himself, in his own encyclical, The Gospel of Life, had pointed that out. Modern societies, we have a way to defend ourselves. We don't need to kill people. And if you have a bloodless means, as he said, to defend, you don't have to kill. And so in my books, and to you today, I tell the stories. What I do when I get on the road is I tell the stories to bring people close. Do we have to keep killing people? Is that the only way we can keep ourselves safe? How do we get into this? What is it doing for us? And I tell the story of the guards. I tell the story of Felton Cootie in the death chamber in Louisiana State Penitentiary. As long as he was supervisor on death row and gave out the meals and took care of things and kept order on the row, he did fine in his job. But then he was appointed over to the TAC team, the tactical team, the execution squad. And his job wasn't even to strap them down. His job wasn't even to do the practice that the guards have to do when they go to kill somebody. Practice when he walks peacefully. Practice when he fights them every inch of the way Lewis Williams here in Ohio. Did you know about what happened with Lewis Williams Jr., who when the guards came for him, he had been quiet in his cell, he'd been reading his Bible, and he put his hands around those bars, and he begins to yell and scream, "Don't kill me! Don't kill me!" The guards have been taught, look, you're just doing your job. The juries have looked at this, but you're just doing your job. And Lewis Williams, they have to pry his hands loose, fighting and screaming. They bring him down to kill him here in Ohio, throw him on to the lethal injection gurney. The guards throwing their body over here so they can strap him down. And one guard was patting his shoulder to say, it's going to be all right. And what happened to Felton Cootie is his job was just to take a paper sack, go to the person's cell after they'd been killed, and collect the toothbrush and clothes and stuff to give the family. You may be asking yourself at this point, yeah, that's terrible. What about the victims? You're going to talk about the victims? Look what they suffered. Look like Patrick Saunier, the first man I ever met on death row, he and his brother. The killing of two innocent teenage kids who had gone to a Catholic high homecoming football game on a November night and were never seen alive again. And the fathers called by the deputies to come to the morgue the next day to identify their children a young man, David LeBlanc, a young girl, Loretta Bork, found near a sugarcane field in Louisiana with bullet holes in the backs of their heads. Every parent's worst nightmare. We're going to talk about the victims? What about the victims? What do you do with something like that? What's justice mean for victims? And I want to invite you to think about this. What happened Tuesday to the victims' families who waited over 20 years for this justice to happen for them? Who waited 20 years to be given their moment where they go get to sit on the front row and watch as Ohio now is going to kill Mr. Broom for the killing of their loved one. What happened to them in the process? And do we really think that the way we heal the human wound of having lost a person to violence is to have somebody wait in a very public way, the wound open to the public, open to the media, every time there's a change in status in the trial? Do we really believe that they get to sit on the front and watch as the state kills and that that's going to heal a human being? When Timothy McVeigh was executed in Oklahoma 5 years after the killing of 168 people, adults and children, it couldn't be worse than this. Half of the victims' families had figured out that watching Timothy McVeigh die over closed-circuit TV, that when they came home afterwards, they still had to face the empty chair. And if you ever go and see the memorial to victims' families, it's sculptures of 168 empty chairs. And that's what happens with violence. So we imitate it, and we say, you get to watch, and that's going to give you closure? What happens to people waiting 20 years for this moment of justice? I've met victims' families. I did one small thing. We started a group because I realized when I began to go to parents of murdered children meetings how alone victims' families are. People stay away from it. It's like why you stay away from a forest fire. Their pain is so great. They say even our friends avoid us. They don't know what to say, or they say, I'm not trained in grief counseling, or we stay away because their pain is great. And I realized, oh my God, they're alone too. They're two pariahs. The pariah of the victim's family who have suffered this terrible pain, and then on the other end, the person that we have said, that monster deserves to die, and they're on death row. One small act to start a victim support group, and I realized all victims' families, what they need is they need counseling, they need friends by their side, they need people in their churches holding their hands and praying with them when they fall apart. The parents, 70% of whom lose a child or go through divorce, people lose their jobs, they can't focus. Where's a community around them to support them? And we hold out for 1% of all the murder victims, 1% to say, here's how your healing's going to happen. Here's how we're going to get justice for you. And to hear it being said at trial, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is only one punishment that can really do justice for a victim's family. They killed, they die. And that's how we honor the victim's family. When New Jersey did away with the death penalty 2 years ago, and New Mexico last year, New Jersey had 62 murder victims' families who testified before the legislature to say, don't kill for us. One father said, this was in Kansas, his little girl had been brutally killed. And he said, our little daughter, when we'd be walking along the sidewalk, she'd say, Daddy, Daddy, don't step on the bug. She wouldn't even step on bugs. Am I going to honor my child by asking for the death of the one who killed her? To honor her, I'm going to honor her through life, not by asking for death. And testimony after testimony after testimony. And there's a shift happening in this country. Death penalties are really down in practice, even in Texas. Terrible crime. Texas, guy arrested by a policeman, grabs a gun from a policeman, shoots a policeman in the back. Policeman has 2 young children. I mean, this is slam dunk, death penalty. In Texas, right? Killed a policeman. Except when the jury heard. A terrible crime. Absolutely terrible crime. But we have life without parole in Texas. What good is it going to do to kill somebody? I've been in the Texas killing chamber where over 400 people have been killed. There are 3 witnessing places. One is for the state's witness, one-way glass. They look out on the gurney. The other's for the victim's family, one-way glass. They look down on the gurney. And the other is where the families and the mothers stand as their child is being killed. Is our way of dealing with violence is the only thing we know is to repeat the violence, that violence can be redemptive of us. And the role religion plays in this, where people just say an eye for an eye, they just quote, that's the one part of the Bible where probably people know the best, at least on this issue. And I just want to say as a little aside, we got to do some real biblical education in our country because, I mean, you ask people about the Bible and like 12% believe Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. I mean, we got a lot of work to do, okay? But I mean, when you're all revved up and just go look at that terrible crime, you're going to pull that Bible quote out and read in Death of Innocence what Justice Antonin Scalia and what he did with Romans 13 to justify the government's actually being the minister of God to execute the wrath of the sword on evildoers. Supreme Court Justice of the United States, eye for an eye, right? And Martin Luther King, when he talked about slavery, he said you're always going to have pillars or suppositions or assumptions holding up when society does something, like slaves. And he said underneath it is the religious underpinning. This is what God wants. And we're obeying God. This is God's will. Justice Scalia has said, for Christians, death is no big deal. Death is no big deal. And besides, Christians expect to be punished for our sins. God exacts punishment, we take punishment. And that's underpinning for the death penalty. You kill, take your punishment now. Take your punishment. Endure death. Because that's really what God wants. God wants pain for pain, life for life. What kind of God is that? Is that a God? Is that the God of Jesus, the compassionate Father? Only a life? Only a death? So the religious underpinnings Martin Luther King brought out, and then he said science, they're going to use science for slavery. I mean, we've done these studies. We've done the head size and everything. People of color have less intelligence than Caucasian people. We can show you scientifically. And don't think that issue's over, folks. The bell curve came out how many years ago? That people of color are really a little bit, deficient. They're not as smart as us, so they have to be controlled. And the other thing that Martin Luther King said, what really upheld slavery was the economics. They needed workers for agriculture. Needed it. Can't have the economy working without them. You got to have them. And so we need to discover, and I invite you to discover the underpinnings here. Here we are, we've been down this death road. The Supreme Court put it back in 76. Do we really need it to be a people of life? What happens to us in the practice of it? And to the extent that we are detached from it or away from it, and we don't know, well, that's what most audiences say when I go to talk to people. I didn't know it was like that. I didn't know that's the way it happened. And so the way we change anything is we have discourse on it. We think about it. We debate. We get information. And I offer you my books as a way of information. Tim Robbins has written the play of Dead Man Walking for universities and schools. And the film of Dead Man Walking and the play of Dead Man Walking is not a Tim Robbins liberal against the death penalty kind of play. All the movie does and all the play does is just open up both sides of this issue. You see the victims' families. You see the person on death row and their families. And you begin to reflect deeply. Is this the kind of society we want to be? And I encourage you here in Ohio to join this group that is here. Ohioans to stop executions. And maybe you got to be educated on the issue, or maybe you're all in favor of these people being executed and you wish there could be more. Wherever you are in the debate, dig into it and get information. And I invite you to reflect more deeply. On the surface of our souls, when there has been a terrible crime, we are outraged, and we should be outraged. Outrage has moral legitimacy in the face of innocent people who have been ripped out of life. But the question for us, what are we going to do with our outrage? And what does it mean to put government in charge of deciding how the criteria are going to be applied and who lives and who dies? When you look at the track record, the worst of the worst, it turns out the opening qualifier is who'd you kill. And over the 1,000 people executed, including the 33 who've been killed in your name here in Ohio, 80% had white victims. When people of color are killed, it's not a blip on the radar screen. 90% of the murders in New Orleans are black on black, and it never reaches trial. You have to be as outraged over the death of people of color and also poor people as you are about others. We don't have a neutral, fair soil in which to grow our tree of justice. We never have. And that's why then human prejudice or political ambitions, you do look at the little study that when there's an election year, prosecutors tend to go for the death penalty more than they do when it's not an election year. You can check this out. It's not good for people who are charged with the defense of society prosecutors to have such temptations in their hands that they're going to go for public office and they're going to use, and what they tell the people, I'm keeping you safe. I got 2 death penalties. My opponent's against the death penalty, and it's not for keeping you safe. That is not worthy of us. I invite you to deepen your souls on this issue and get information and then to get involved. We have for the Ohioans to stop executions. The what? The Cleveland Coalition. That those of you so moved, I hope you will get engaged, because until you put your hand on the rope to change it, we're all part of the system, and our silence is our compliance. Thank you.
Take a seat now. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to Helen Prejean. And we welcome, in a moment, all your questions to our guest. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and remind you to keep them brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, and one of our many radio stations across the country. Radio broadcasts of the City Club are made possible through the generous support of Case Western Reserve University. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS, IdeaStream, and Time Warner Cable. Television broadcasts are supported by National City, now a part of PNC, and Cleveland State University. Closed captioning is supported by Nordstrom Corporation. Our live webcasts are supported by the University of Akron. Today's forum is the annual Karen Faith Witt and A.H. Weinstein Memorial Forum on the Persecution of Peoples. This forum was endowed with generous gifts from the late Dale Sally in memory of his friend Karen Faith Witt, and from Norman Weinstein in memory of his father, A.H. Weinstein. With us today is Ellen Botnick, Ms. Witt's sister. Will you please stand so that we can show our appreciation? We are pleased to welcome to our forum today students who are here as part of our City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. Today we welcome students from John Adams High School, St. Edward's High School, Villa Angela, St. Joseph High School, and Gilmore Academy. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Oh, okay. And please let us recognize Norm Weinstein also, who is here today as part of our forum. Norm? Thank you. We are also pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by the ACLU of Cleveland, or of Ohio, excuse me, the Legal Aid Society, and Baker Hostetler. Today is also the Battisti Memorial Lecture presented in partnership with the Case Western Reserve University Law School. Now we would like to return to our speaker and our traditional City Club question and answers. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are PR and Programs Manager Carrie Miller and Education and Outreach Coordinator Deborah Agasti. Now, first question, please.
Good afternoon, sister.
Good afternoon.
My name is Joseph Meisner. I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Society, and I want to give you a little test. You mentioned the victims' families. Yesterday, we were out in front of our National City Bank across the street gathering signatures against the death penalty. And a man came up to us. He told us that 10 years ago, his daughter was murdered, and they've never found the killer. He also told us that every day of his life, it's a terrible burden for him to carry. And he then signed our petition, and he looked at us. And my question and test to you is, what should we have said in return to him?
Well, thank you for signing the petition for a start. No, what do we say when people have endured such great pain? I have a friend he teaches sociology at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and they have started with these cold cases of unsolved murders. When you're putting all of your resources into getting a few people for murder with the death penalty, look how many unsolved murders remain on the books, because you don't have resources for everything. And that man had the grace and the wisdom to figure out that selecting people for the death penalty, even if he could have gotten that, is doing nothing for his pain. And cold cases are a huge problem. I mean, we have a large number of unsolved murders. What makes the public really safer? Picking a few people. It's less than 1% of all the murders where we go for the death penalty are putting those resources into community policing and just even improving the rate at which we even solve crimes so that people know who is the perpetrator, at least, of who killed our loved one.
Sister, of the things which you said, one rings in my ears, that the United States is today the only advanced democracy that still uses the death penalty.
That was our introducer who said that.
Thank you.
But I'll claim it too.
Good. And I wonder if in your travels you have come to some sense of why other countries have moved away from it and we have not.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, seeing the abuses that happened with government after World War II and what happened with the Holocaust. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was crucial in that. Universal Declaration meaning in Articles 3 and 5, no one should be tortured and no one should be killed. 40 years ago, only a handful of nations, seeing the death penalty as a part of torture and killing of defenseless people, embraced abolishing the death penalty. Now, out of the 190-plus nations of the world, a majority. The reason is human rights. A lot of people ask me, well, look, on this issue of the death penalty, people don't have your faith or belief in Jesus or whatever. What's the common ground people are going to stand on? The common ground is human rights. Articles 3 and 5 state, no one should be tortured, no one should be killed. Everyone has a right to life. And when Eleanor Roosevelt was in there, naturally, when they went to write it, they said, well, everyone has a right to life, except those who do crimes and get the death penalty. And she held out. She said, no, this is a universal declaration that we want to hold on to so that we can move toward the ideal of it. That's the reason. Rwanda did away with the death penalty a year ago. Look at all the murders in Rwanda. Imagine if you're going to now say, those who did the worst torture and killing, we are going to demand the death penalty of them. What would happen to Rwanda? And year after year, another country is added. And I do want to tell you that when New Jersey abolished the death penalty and when New Mexico abolished the death penalty, they lit the Roman amphitheater in Rome, the oldest symbol of state killing that we have in the world. And the movement toward human rights is palpable in the world. When you get to the United States, Japan also, which imitates the United States in a lot of ways, when we abolish it, Japan is going to abolish it too. Because they said, well, look, the United States does it. I think the only reason we are, in fact, are shutting down the death penalty in practice. You got to know that. Starting in 2001, death penalties, where more people now know about life without parole and give juries half a chance they're going to choose life. In practice, the death penalty is in diminishment. Even we haven't had an execution in Louisiana in 7 years. Louisiana, you're doing more execution. You have 5 people scheduled to be killed before February in this state of Ohio. I don't get it about Ohio. No, I just don't. I really don't. In the deep South states, where, you know, the states that practice slavery, Ohio, you had the Underground Railroad here. I don't know. It's about educating the people, though. Because who thinks about the death penalty? And they just say, well, you know, there's some terrible criminals. Yeah, we're so removed from it. And so that's why it's still in place. Educate, wake up the people. Thurgood Marshall said that. People say they support the death penalty, but it's an uneducated opinion. Educate the people, and they'll reject the death penalty.
Sister Helen, you make a very compelling argument for abolishing the death penalty. The people on the other side, though, who say we should continue the death penalty, say that it's a deterrent to people who otherwise would commit murder, the fact that they themselves will someday be put to death. How do you answer those people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we got a track record now. Let's look at the track record. See the states that have executed the most. Has the crime rate, the murder rate gone down? Let's look at the states that don't execute. Has the murder rate risen? Is it, in fact, a deterrent? And the track record well bears out, in general, roughly they're double the number of homicides in the states that execute than in the states that don't. And you always have to look at the soil of poverty, crime, that leads to violence in societies. That's the root causes of violence. Death penalty's got nothing to do with it. And there was a opinion poll and interviews with police chiefs across the United States, and 10 remedies were given. And one of them was the death penalty, increasing the death penalty. The others were dealing with drug addiction, to help people deal with that, doing more community policing, working with at-risk kids to get jobs. And in the police chiefs, the last, dead last on the list was the death penalty. And the way they put it, and I've talked in wardens of prisons, the people doing the thinking and the people doing the murdering are 2 separate sets of people. And if you're not thinking of consequences, you know, I'm about to murder somebody, oh, what'll it be, like life without parole or death penalty? You know, they're not thinking of consequences. Most murders are people who know each other, and they are not thinking of consequences. So we could boil people in oil, and if they're doing this crime out of the exigency of the moment, laced with drugs, alcohol, gun, bang, 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 that's the way most murders happen. So we got the track record to show now that it's not a deterrent. How could it be? The warden at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, you know what he told me one time? He said, sister, you know who makes the best trustees in this prison? Or the people who come in for murder. He said, most people commit murder. It's not that they're serial killers and there are real sociopaths now. And that's a special part of the prison where people like that are put. But he said, most of the guys in here, they never thought they were going to commit murder when they woke up in the morning. And they get here in the discipline of the prison, maybe get a little education. He said, make our best trustees. So we have images of murderers they kill, and they're going to kill again, and they're going to come out and get you and your grandkids unless you give them the death penalty. We don't need the death penalty to be safe.
Sister Helen, thank you for stopping by today. I enjoyed your presentation. Do you think that part of the problem is people are too insulated from the death penalty itself?
Absolutely.
Yeah, indeed, I was astonished when some of my coworkers criticized me for taking a half day off of work to come here and listen to this.
You're mixing up with the radical nun?
Yes, I was going to say, do you, in all seriousness, think it would help if these were more public?
Absolutely.
If you were to require that these be, broadcast or on the news or something, people would really see what it's like. And
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry. What made me think this is there was even a small outpouring of sympathy for Saddam Hussein when the tapes of his hanging came out. And they spent a lot of time, money, and effort vilifying him. That might be the solution to ending this.
Yeah. Well, here's what I think. The closer you get to it, see, and the more you see what's involved in the killing of an actual human being and the guards and all the people involved, the closer you get to it, the quicker you reject it. Head of Department of Corrections in Louisiana, see Paul Phelps, and I have a conversation. He says, when it's time for an execution, I got people lined up across the Mississippi River saying, I'll witness, I'll witness. He said, they never ask again. It's the protocol. When you see the scripted death, when you see, then feel the silence, and they're the guards, they're strapping him down. He's saying his last words, and you see the killing of a human being. This is not to say that people who do murders are heroes. Mr. Broom is not a hero. Mr. Broom did a horrible crime, and we're outraged over his crime. But why is it when you say, well, they stuck him 18 times, they were trying hard, he's trying to help him, he's rubbing it along the vein like maybe here, let's get this over with. And I believe but it is a secret ritual, and one of the things when I witnessed the first execution with Patrick Saunier came out of the Louisiana death chamber on the night of April 4th, 1984, I threw up. I had never seen a human being killed deliberately in front of my eyes. And I realized that night, the people are never going to see this. I got to tell the story. It's what brings me before you today. And that's why I wrote the books, to take you there, to just say, look at it, look at it. We have to deal with the outrage we feel, outrage that is legitimate. But what does it mean for us as a society? They were about to kill a guy. I forgot the state and I forgot the man's name, but he'd done a terrible crime, and the journalists were allowed to meet with him the day before, and they said, well, Mr. So-and-so, look at what you did. Look at your crime. Can you give us one good reason why the state shouldn't execute you tomorrow? And he said, yeah. He said, because you're better than I am. Maybe in books of justice, people deserve to die for what they did, but who deserves to kill them? It is us.
Sister, thank you for your ministry. Over here.
Oh, okay.
I was fortunate to attend the lecture last night, and at the reception afterwards, I was making a point to introduce myself to people who I didn't know. And two of the people whom I ended up talking with, I was asking them why they had come to hear you speak. And each of them had had a close relative who had been murdered. And it made me realize that the most significant part of your ministry, perhaps, is your effort to try and bring real closure to those who live after the death of a loved one. Could you just talk about best practices and what people can do in that regard? Those of us who are fortunate not to have ever lost a loved one.
Yeah. Well, first, I've met enough people now who've been through this journey of losing a loved one. The hero of Dead Man Walking is Lloyd LeBlanc, whose son David, their only son, was murdered by Patrick Saunier and his brother. He was the first one to teach me about the healing process inside. And you see, it's in Louisiana. Everybody was telling him, Lloyd, you got to be for the death penalty. They killed David, the only son. You got to be for the death penalty. And he said to me, I tried. He said, I tried to go to that place like, I want to see him dead. They killed our son. He said, but I didn't like what it did to me. Because he said, I've always been a kind person. I like to help people. And I learned it from my mom and daddy, and I try to follow the way of Jesus. And then I said to myself, they killed my son, but I'm not going to let them kill me. I'm going to do what Jesus said. And there are more and more psychological studies and even testimonies and coming out that anger at the beginning of a process when you're in trauma and you're grieving is good. It gets you out of bed in the morning. It keeps you from wanting to commit suicide. But if anger is sustained, then we begin to deteriorate inside. It eats us alive. There's a Native American proverb, the one who goes on the journey of revenge should first dig 2 graves. So see, our society, how can we heal? Best practices. We need to have murder victim support groups that give real healing help to victims. And that means churches surrounding them. The Catholic Church in Louisiana began in the Lafayette Diocese where the murders had happened of the LeBlanc and Bourque children, to have once a year the bishop saying the Mass, gathering the victims' families of those who have experienced murder, for the community to pray with them and to form support groups and for healing. We need to do that all over this nation. And that's a best practice. Restorative justice, not vengeful justice of demanding a life for life, is the life road for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Today at the City Club of Cleveland Forum, we have been listening to Sister Helen Prejean, author of Death of Innocence and Dead Man Walking. Thank you, Sister Helen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Since 1845, National City has opened doors to opportunity and success for Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. Caring about doing what's right for our customers is part of our heritage. This City Club Forum broadcast is made possible in part by National City.